Welcome to today's webinar from us here at GREI, the hows and whys of sharing data in generalist repositories. Um, there's three of us that are going to be presenting today. So first, you're going to hear from me, Aaron Doran, who I work at Elsevier as part of the support team for Digital Commons Data, the premium version of Mendeley Data. We're also going to hear from Gretchen Gigan and Lisa Curtin. Um, so sort of to go over the agenda, I'm going to cover the first portion of the agenda today. So introduction to GREI, generalist data repositories in the NIH data sharing ecosystem, and selecting a repository for data sharing. Gretchen is going to then jump in and talk about data sharing best practices and data discovery practices. And then finally, we'll have Lisa covering examples of NIH research shared in GREI repositories, how to connect with us here at GREI, and then also lead our feedback and question section that we have planned for the end. Obviously, the Q&A is open now, so please feel free to drop in questions as you have them, and we'll either do our best to respond to them in the course of the presentation or via the Q&A box that Zoom provides. Please also know there'll be a number of polls over the course of the presentation, so this will be a bit interactive. So please also keep an eye out for those and be ready to share your experiences and answers and all of that good stuff. Getting into it, let's get to an introduction to the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative, or GREI, as we like to call it, because you always need a pronounceable acronym. What is GREI? So GREI is a initiative sponsored by the NIH, where seven member repositories that you can see listed up at the top have come together in what is called a co-opetition model to help make the generalist repositories that are available to you as researchers better, consistent, and we can see there's these objectives also listed on the slide. And I think for the purposes of this presentation, we're really going to look at you know, implementing best practices for data repositories, supporting discovery of NIH-funded data, and of course, conducting outreach, which is what I'm doing right now. So we have a number of objectives we're trying to complete, and using NIH resources and guidance to help make all of this happen, to make your lives as researchers better. And how we are trying to make things easier for you when it comes to data sharing is, excuse me, is by developing cohesive and interoperable generalist repository landscape. So we want, when you go to share data, if you don't have an existing domain repository available to you, we want you to have somewhere to go. The NIH wants you to have somewhere to go. And so that's a big part of this mission. And also implementing common best practices and standards so that, when you do find yourself at a generalist repository, it's going to have and there's a slide that talks a little bit about more later with what we call desirable characteristics that you want that the repository will have. So, when you're sharing your data, you're going to be sharing it in a way you need to be, right? And it's doing the things you need it to do. And so, of course, making data sharing easier by making having places for that data to go. So GREI repositories, is that the right order? Yeah. Is what this means is that when it comes to GREI repositories, there's going to be a lot of similarities, right? We all agree to meet fair data sharing access across disciplines. And for those unfamiliar with the acronym FAIR, that stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, interoperable, I can't say that word today, and reusable. We want to all adhere to some specific best practices. And the other thing we do is rather than similar to that famous XKCD comic of we will solve it by creating the one true standard, instead look at community standards that already exist, such as working with DataCite and their metadata schema, or ensuring that we work with persistent identifiers from ORCID and ROR. Since those are already out there in the community, better to leverage those than to, try and come up with something new. Um, each repository is its own thing. We do have our own independent, distinct attributes. Some of us are nonprofit organizations, some of us are sponsored by academic institutions, and a number of us are also commercial organizations. We all have a mix of open source and proprietary infrastructures, and we all offer varying features around data visualization, file types and sizes, and curation and things like that. But I sort of the metaphor I thought of before is it's almost like buying a car where you go to buy a new car, it's gonna have AC and have a turn signal on the steering wheel, generally speaking, because that's all good standards. But they may be like, oh, well, this approaches how they handle their engine differently or something, right? So all of that's to say, how is GREI improving discoverability? Across all of repositories. Again, this is where that standardization, I think, of behind what we're trying to do comes in. Discoverability across search engine indexes. We all because we all want to adopt DataCite's metadata standards. We're all very easily indexed in DataCite, right? So that makes finding data sets in generalist repositories easier, and you can be confident that it will be findable because we are already working with these established players. Ensuring that we all have common metadata standards, so discovery and reuse is easier. We're all taking on product enhancements for tracking and reuse of NIH data as part of that standards development. We are all working together to develop a common way to talk about metrics. So again, that interoperability is there for you. Data citations, making sure you get credit for your work. So with that, we get to our first poll question of the day. Were you aware of GREI before this event? And hopefully I've done it for those of you saying no, which it's a good number of you. I hope I'm doing a good job introducing it to you. So, um, so I'll let that hang for a minute and go ahead and keep moving forward as we talk about um, generalist data repositories in the NIH data sharing ecosystem, because we don't see generalist repositories as one as the be all end all, right? We're part of a larger ecosystem of data repositories, across disciplines and various NIH centers and institutes. And we want to be just one part of that, right? Because a stronger repository landscape is going to make you as researchers, the more places you have to go to share your data, the more options you have, right? The more you can get into something specific or find something in your specific niche. But a big part of, not everyone has that domain specific repository. So we want to create a place where if you're not sure where to go, we are a trusted space that the NIH has said, hey, you can trust them, and you have a place to share that data because you're going to need to. And so, keeping it, helping catalyze the flexible sharing of data, right? Because it may not be able to be shared elsewhere. And so we want you to have that place. It's almost like being a safety net. So next poll question. Have you ever used a repository to publish and share data or research? Um, and I'll let you all get a chance to answer before carrying on. Um, and also get a drink of water. All right. What do we mean when we say a generalist repository? I feel like I've used this word a lot, and I haven't really talked about what I mean when I say it, or I've sort of talked around it. So when I talk about a generalist repository, when we at GREI talk about generalist repositories, we are talking about repositories that will accept data regardless of their data type, their format, what the content of the data is, what the disciplinary focus of the data is, or the methodology of the data, right? We don't have standards around any of those. If you are data, we take it. Um, and then here's where when we talk about what a generalist repository should do, and really what us in the NIH think any repository should have, are what we call these desirable characteristics, right? When choosing and when you as a researcher have completed, are ready to start making your data available, where what is the bare minimum that data repository should be doing so that you're in the right place. You want it to have unique persistent identifiers. You want it to have long-term sustainability. You want to know that repository will be up and your data will remain available for as long as possible. Have high quality metadata. Assist with curation and quality assurance so that you know that this repository is only having good, well-structured data, no spam, that kind of stuff. You want it to be free and easy access. You want it to have ways for you to show that your data can have broad or measured reuse is appropriate, have clear user guidance so that, when you just show up with no context, you know exactly what to do. You want it to be secure. You want it to be confidential. You want it to be in a common format so that everybody, has an easy time processing it and you're not having to dig up user guides on some obscure process. Show the provenance of the data and, of course, have some sort of retention policy. Um, so that's a generalist repository. That's what we think they should do. But really, the main thrust for you as a researcher is this question of, selecting a repository for data sharing, right? You're at that phase where you need to make your data available. Where do you go, right? How do you know where to go? So in terms of a poll question to see where you're at now, where do you currently share your data or research? How many times have you used a repository to publish data, right? Um, Give you all a chance to start filling that in. Um, Great. So yeah, where do you go? How do you know where to go? So one nice thing is that the NIH has put together this page. They put together a number of pages, really. But one main one you're going to see is this one here. That is functionally a directory of all NIH-supported scientific data repositories. You can go to this page. You'll see the link here at the bottom of the slide. And or excuse me. Um, you'll have the links here at the bottom of the slide, and you can go through here and see, oh, okay, this domain specific repository is funded by this center. Here's its name. Here's the kind of content it's accepting. And you'll also notice on the top of that page, which is what this pop out is representing, is that in this page also has a listing of generalist repositories that exist all data types, which will take you to a page that more or less lists all the GREI repositories in it. You may also be unsure about sharing policies. GREI, or the NIH, excuse me, has that available. So you'll see there's like an other sharing policies tab on that site. And this will let you go and see which repositories meet which centers' data sharing policies, let you see copies of those data sharing policies because that may be relevant depending on which specific center within the NIH is funding your research. They do also have a separate tab for genomic data sharing, since that will have its own sort of kettle of fish attached to it. And so that's also available to you through the NIH. When looking at repositories, the rule of thumb is the NIH encourages this. We encourage it as well, is that if there is a domain specific repository that exists for your area of research, that should be your first choice. Um, whether whatever discipline, whatever research topic that is, if there's something within your domain that's available, go with that first. But if you cannot locate a repository for your discipline, or you're working with a type of data that isn't correct for that domain specific repository or something like that, that's where we come in as a generalist repository. The NIH does not recommend a specific generalist repository. Again, this is a co-opetition model, so we're not, none of us are the favorite child or anything like that. But uh, we are, you can see here in this list, right? We are the set of generalist repositories working with the NIH and have been vetted by them. So they do list all of us together as potential options. Um, you'll also find on this page, one thing we have is a generalist repository comparison chart. So this is something that we made as part of GREI, so that if you are looking at generalist repositories and there's 7 options, right? You want to be able to make the decision of like, do I go with Zenodo? Do I go with Mendeley Data? Do I go with Figshare? Which one should I use? You have a way to help in that decision making process with this comparison chart. But again, as part of being GREI, as part of this ecosystem, we all have common features, that core metadata, those persistent identifiers, the discoverability, fair data sharing, on and on. So, and the one of the next things I want to look at is a use case. So, looking at a use case that I think will match up with a lot of you here today, as an NIH intramural researcher, I want to select a repository to share my data so that I comply with the data management and sharing plan for my project. And you're going to ask, as you go to any repository, generalist, domain specific, or otherwise, is this repository a good fit for my data? Right. And the kind of questions you want to be asking yourself as you evaluate these repositories are, do they accept data from any discipline? Am I the right discipline for this domain specific repository, or is this a generalist one, right? Is it an appropriate home? And that sort of gets to point 2, or does it have a better home somewhere specific? Can it take the data in any format or multiple formats? And I don't want to just read a slide to you, but these are the things like you want to look at and think about when you're picking that repository, right? Does it fit into these parameters? And so we have another poll question for you. What factors have an impact on your choice of repository now, right? When you've been doing this, what have you been looking at first? I'll give you all a chance. Well, I'm going to go ahead and keep going. Or I guess, right, that was my last slide. So I'll give you a little more time to answer that. And so now that I've covered sort of the basics of GREI and the basics of choosing a repository, I'm going to pass things over to Gretchen to talk about data sharing best practices.
Great, thanks, Aaron. So hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm going to talk about sharing data. So once we've picked a repository, how do we set ourselves up for success in sharing data? So if you go to the next slide, you will see, believe it or not, another poll. Um, so this poll question is, if you're a librarian or in another research support role, have you received requests for assistance to upload data to a generalist repository? Um, So I closed the poll, so I don't know how we're doing there. But Amanda will, thanks. We'll close that when we've got some good responses there. So the first thing to think about when we're sharing data, even before we start to think about how we're going to share it, is to try and think about what our data is and what are its characteristics, because those can affect decisions we might make. Might make. So data can come in a lot of different formats, text, numeric, or multimedia. It can also be, very specific to a particular domain, or it can be very specific to a piece of equipment or a proprietary standard. Then the data itself, the content of the data, can be nominal data, which is categorized with no quantitative values. So things, that are just sort of labels or descriptors, hair color, religion, sexual orientation, college major, etc. Ordinal data does have an order, but isn't numeric. So academic grades, A, B, C, D, E, F. Education degree, bachelor, master's, doctoral, etc. Discrete data is something you can count. So it's numerical data that you can count. So the number of students in a classroom, the number of computers in a given space. And finally, continuous data is also numerical, but it's something that you measure. So the temperature or the time it takes to complete a task. And then finally, data can originate in different ways. It can be observed, it can be found by experiments, it can be simulated, and it can even be derived or compiled by a machine. So ultimately, data is really any collection of facts from which conclusions can be drawn. But because it's so diverse, we have a lot of different aspects to think of when we share it. So on the next slide, you'll see, once we know what our data is, we can go through some steps to share it in a way that's fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So these steps actually came from Dryad, 6 steps to get to that point. And I'm going to go through each one in a little more depth. So on the next slide, you'll see the first step, is to gather all of the data that would be necessary for someone to reuse your data set and replicate the analysis in your publication. So you want to gather and organize everything. This could include experimental method details, raw data files, data tables that are more organized, scripts, other kinds of output. There's several levels of data processing involved in a project, and it's important to provide adequate detail for each of those different levels of processing. But don't hesitate to edit out superfluous or ambiguous content that would be confusing. It's important to provide both unprocessed and processed data if you can, because the unprocessed data can be very valuable for reanalysis. Including that unprocessed data ensures that, first of all, no details are lost when you process it, and any issues that may have happened through the processing pipeline can be discovered and rectified that way. But processed data is also important to include because it is cleaned, formatted, and it is organized. Programming scripts and other parts of processes and scripts are also very important. That ensures that someone can reproduce your results using the data. And you should add, any informative comments directly into code and scripts to help users understand it. If we go to the next slide, our next process, once we have gathered all our data, We ideally want to be able to share everything publicly, and we want everything to have a license. Um, so it's important to identify materials that need to be restricted. In some repositories, you'll be able to upload content and restrict access, and in others, you will only be able to share openly available materials. So some common things you might want to think about and find out whether they need to be restricted are content from published articles, grants, patents, and data from third parties that might have kinds of restricted terms of use. All content, however, whether it's restricted in some way or openly available, should be properly licensed. So the creator needs to select a license that's applicable, and they're encouraged to choose the most expansive license possible. Sometimes creators think that not including a license is the most open way to share, but in fact, it's the opposite. If you don't include a license, then the user has no idea what they can do. They have actually not been given permission to use it. The default is that someone doesn't have permission to license or use your material. So you have to put a license on it that says that they can use it. And it's also the least ambiguous thing to always include a license. In addition, very specific things like human subject data has to be anonymized and prepared under legal and ethical guidelines. And if you work with vulnerable or endangered species, it might be necessary to mask locations to prevent further threats to population. Go to the next one. Then to maximize that accessibility and reusability and preservability, we want to share data in non-proprietary open formats like plain text whenever possible. And that ensures that your data will be accessible and usable by the largest amount of people. You can look at various guidelines for lists of formats. I know the National Archives has a really great list of formats they consider the best for preservation that takes into account many of the same issues you would when sharing your data, whether or not it's open, an open standard, whether or not it's well documented. In research, however, a lot of data is created and saved in proprietary formats that need to very specifically be used for the types of analysis that's going on. So in those cases, saving original raw or unprocessed data alongside the proprietary format or an alternate file in a non-proprietary format can be a helpful way to get around that as much as possible. You also want to review your files for errors like missing data, misnamed files, mislabeled variables. And another best practice is to try to use the smallest file version possible. So you do want to include as much as you can. So using some kind of file compression can be helpful to compress large files themselves or directories of files. Then we go to the next step, which is about organizing things logically. So we want to name files and directories in a consistent and descriptive manner, and we want to avoid vague and ambiguous naming conventions. So the first thing is to just start as simple as you can. Pick a couple of rules for naming your files. There's no general set of rules that's going to work for everybody and every project and every type of data. But what matters is that you have rules that you can stay consistent with and that you then document those decisions. You think you'll understand down the line, but you probably won't, or you'll have someone else who's coming in from the outside wanting to reuse this data who won't understand how you've named files. So documenting the decision of how those files were named can be very helpful later on. And the README, which we'll talk about in a second, is a place to do that. It's best to make your file names as machine readable as possible. And what that means is doing various things to make it possible to sort or filter names. So including the date by the year, month, and day allows you to chronologically sort. Using the same kind of code or abbreviation in files that are part of a specific project or from a specific collection or lab, that allows you to filter files by that abbreviation. And also using versioning numbers helps to make that far less ambivalent and also machine readable as well, because they'll be consistent. You won't include things like final and draft and final, no really final in your file names. But that said, human readability is also important in your file names. So as self-explanatory as possible while still being pretty consistently formatted is best. Once the files are understandable, you can also think about the organization of the entire set of materials. Creating a logical directory of files helps with understanding. So putting things in subdirectories, like things together in subdirectories, helps to convey to the user who's looking at it a quick sense of everything that's included. And locations and names for those directories can reflect what the type of material is in there, why it was created, or how it relates to other files. Going through this organization process also gives you the opportunity to remove anything that's unnecessary. And on the next slide, we're going to make a comprehensive README file and descriptive metadata. So a README file is just a plain text file that captures a variety of context and instructions for new users to the work or the data set. So essential information about the files, the data types, the formats, context, can all be in a README file that is called README to get the attention of the user to read this first before they start engaging with the data. Even if a README file is included, though, it's also important to capture rich descriptive detail in the metadata used by whichever repository you select. Not all platforms can search the full text of README files. So you also really need to have the essentials in metadata so that it can be searchable and discovered. In the README file and as guidelines for the metadata, you want to think about writing clearly for a broad audience, being comprehensive but as concise as possible, and using vocabularies that are recognized in the discipline. You want to discuss what the research is about, how it was created, possibly who to contact about it. You want to define variables, abbreviations, codes, and units. It's important to describe actually how you have encoded blank cells or missing data so that it's understandable that it isn't just an error. The dates and locations of data collections can be useful. Description in the README file of the structure, and we want to name things to make it self-descriptive, but we can also use the README to reinforce that. And then we also want to describe any code, script, software, or process that you use to analyze the data. So in short, it's really any details that could influence reuse or replication. And then our final step, number 6, is to decide where to share your data. So Aaron just talked about this. There are lots of factors that can go into a decision of where you want to share. What's the best place? A discipline-specific repository is usually the best place if it exists, but it may not. In addition to the chart that Aaron showed, there's also the flow chart that the GREI group has put together to help aid in decision-making about which GREI repository to use. So I'm going to move on then to data discovery. So once we have shared our own data and we may want to start maybe our next project, we want to find some other data or find some other data to reuse. And there's lots of ways you can find research data, and they vary. So we're going to talk about a couple of consistent things you might be able to do when searching for data. So if we go to the next slide, we have another poll. Have you ever used a repository to find and reuse data or research? I'll give you a second and maybe cough. Pardon me. Okay. Great. So I'm going to move on then while you fill this out. So before diving into a search, you can take a minute to think about what the data you're interested in is and where it might be located. So Identifying the type of data you need to answer your research question might be a first step. So, like we talked about a little bit ago, your data may be quantitative, it may be qualitative, it may be uh, text or statistics or a spreadsheet, or it may be images, it may be multimedia, it may be code. So thinking about what type of data you're looking for can help you to first start to formalize your query. Sorry. You also want to think about the geographic scope. A lot of data is made available by and created by county, state, nationwide, global organizations. So thinking about the jurisdiction of where the data is that you're interested in can help to guide you to a repository or how to search for it, because those geographic terms can help to limit your search. You might also want to think about organizations or agencies that are likely to have collected or shared the kind of data you're looking for. So, what kinds of data are different federal agencies gathering? What is data that's gathered by health organizations as opposed to industry organizations? And then you might want to identify a specific resource, a specific agency. After you've kind of narrowed things down, you may find, I know exactly the agency I want to look for this. I know exactly the domain specific repository I want to look to. Or maybe this is very interdisciplinary, or there isn't a space just for this question. It's very novel, and I want to go to a generalist repository, or I want to search multiple sites. On the next slide, once you have identified where you want to search, you can think about your search strategy and how you're going to query the repository. So all of the GREI repositories support the DataCite metadata schema, as we talked about, but they do have different search functionalities. So some things you want to maybe look at in the repository before you start to think about how exactly you'll formulate a query are all of them will undoubtedly have keyword searching, but you might want to look to see if they offer some kinds of advanced search that will allow you to leverage specific metadata fields, search within specific fields, or facet or filter specific fields, or combine terms in specific ways. Some of them will offer you different ways to search by specific metadata fields, like that funding agency, content type, geographic location. All of those things are things we just talked about in terms of thinking about where our data is. You might also do a literature search to find, published literature on a topic, and then kind of track backward to see where is data deposited for that journal, or if it's a journal that has a lot of articles that are relevant to your interests, see which repositories it supports and go back and search that way by looking for a reference to that journal. And then, excuse me, finally, lots of repositories will offer you options to browse and to, if you don't have a very clear idea of what types of data might exist, being able to kind of look through featured data sets or collections can give you a sense of how to make a more precise query for learning from what you see. And then finally, use all of the sorting and filtering and refining that you can. Publication year, most recent, sometimes file extension or funder can be useful as well. So if we go to the next slide, so all of these use cases actually come from a document that the GREI group created, a catalog of use cases. And so in this use case, we're imagining an NIH-funded researcher who wants to find research data, to validate findings, to reuse it, and to build on work within their discipline. So two things that the researcher might be thinking about as they start this search is, first of all, does this repository have data I can use? Does it have data from my discipline, data in a format that I can use or know how to use? Data that's shared with all of the software and documentation that would be needed for me to use it, and data with good quality metadata and a good data quality itself. But then I also might think about whether or not the repository provides information to me so that I know whether or not I can reuse this data. Does it have licensing clearly indicated with materials? Does it help to provide citation information so that I can be sure to credit it? And does it have, all of that kind of information like you'd find in README files that will help me to know how to reuse this data? So one more slide moving forward. So another option, rather than searching a specific repository, can be using a tool that searches across several repositories at once. So this type of search won't usually support a very specific or very granular search, but it can be very wide, which can be good if you are really looking for like a diamond in the rough. So Google Dataset Search is a relatively new feature that Google supports that aggregates, normalizes, and reconciles open metadata to allow users to search specifically for datasets across the web. So like any Google search, you're going to get a lot of hits back, and you're going to have to review a lot of them to figure out which ones are relevant. Another relatively new tool that aggregates data sources is the National Library of Medicine's data catalog, NLM's dataset catalog. So currently it curates data from a few of the GREI repositories actually, and has plans to add many more to its collection. And finally, DataCite Commons is also an option to search specifically for datasets. It contains entries for anything that has a registered DOI in DataCite. So datasets, but also many other types of things. But if the creators use the specific DataCite metadata term for dataset, you can use the DataCite Commons search and filter just for datasets there. So that's all of my section. I'm going to hand off to Lisa now to talk about some examples of research shared in GREI repositories.
Thanks, Gretchen. Yeah, I know we're running kind of low on time, so if either of you want to take a look at the questions still in the Q&A, feel free to respond. But yeah, I am Lisa. I'm going to share some examples of NIH-funded data that has been shared in the different GREI repositories. I mean, these are just examples, and I'm not a researcher, so please, don't ask me questions about the specific data, but we're going to use this data to kind of highlight some different features or desirable characteristics of the GREI repositories. And many of these features that I'm going to point out here are offered by multiple repositories. So, just because I'm showing it on one repository doesn't mean that it's not offered elsewhere, but you will want to look at that comparison chart and flow chart that we've referenced, to look at those details or look at those differences in more detail. And if we could go to the next slide, I see the poll is already up. So thank you all for responding to that. But yes, we've got a couple poll questions. Just, you can fill in free text, whatever types of data you've shared, just some basic details about those. And then if you've used any of the Generalist repositories, we'd love to hear which ones, and you can select more than one option there. But if you could go to the next, Aaron, we'll keep it moving while people answer that, because I know we've got not too much time. So before I start going through each of these, just you can see on each slide here, I've kind of tried to highlight where related articles have been published and which NIH ICs have funded the data. But with that, I want to just get into quickly these examples. So here we've got Dataverse, the data, and I wanted to highlight their collection feature. So this data set is part of a collection that allows, and collections in Dataverse allow you to kind of bring together whatever data you want in one place, and then you can even use widgets to then take that data and display it on other sites. So that kind of gives you a little bit of an interactive option. Next slide, please. And then another feature here that several of our repositories offer is file level metadata. So with file level metadata, you can get a DOI not only for your entire data set, but also for each file within the data set. And that facilitates increased findability, interoperability, reusability of your data, because you can find specific files and even in some cases search the contents of those individual files, which makes it just that much more accessible, findable. Next slide, please. So next, and like I said, just kind of flying through the different repositories, we've got Dryad. This is a data set with some behavioral neural recordings from different macaques. Here I've highlighted data versioning, which is a feature supported across the GREI repositories. Versioning helps to support and promote reproducibility and collaboration by monitoring changes to data sets over time. So here you can see they uploaded data in 2 different versions, once in August and then once in September 2023. Next slide, please. And then here's the same data set from Dryad. We're still looking at that. It's another way to support reproducibility. You know, Gretchen mentioned you want to share not only your data, but supporting software, code, and scripts. Dryad accepts data only into their repository, but to facilitate sharing of these related objects, they have an integration that allows you to directly upload your software to Zenodo as part of that process of publishing your data set to Dryad. So, you know, it's kind of a one-stop. You submit it along with your data, and your data gets published to Dryad, and your other objects will be published to Zenodo, and they'll be linked together for you. So it kind of takes some of the work off of you. So it's a great little integration there. Next slide, please. And then that brings me to my repository, which is Figshare. Here I've got an example collection in Figshare. Collections allow you to group multiple data sets together under a single DOI, and that makes it just easier to share a bunch of data sets at once. So instead of sharing 12 different DOIs for this data set, you can collect them all. They'll all have their own DOI if you need to cite them individually, but you can just share that single collection DOI that's on the page there to kind of just facilitate that sharing and making it easier on the researcher. Next slide, please. And then another thing I wanted to highlight, and again, this is something all the repositories offer, but it may look a little bit different from repository to repository, is funding metadata. It's important to include your funding information with your data sets when you publish them, because that helps the NIH with tracking data sharing compliance and, you know, making sure you know that the parameters of your grant are met. So for us at Figshare, our funding metadata links to our the Dimensions research database, which includes a lot of details about grants that, you know, just creates that much more rich of metadata for you automatically. Next slide, please. And then just I wanted to point out here, this data set in particular, this collection is using actually multiple repositories. So in addition to 12 data sets published in Figshare, if you look at the data availability statement from their publication, they also have data sets published in OSF and OpenNeuro. So it's an example of, you know, like we've been talking about, you want to use the repositories that are most suited for your data. So in this case, I think the image data sets that are in Figshare were probably too big for some of these other, not OSF, but for the OpenNeuro repository. And then, you know, they were using OSF for other things, other functionalities. So they've used different repositories as each of them suited different needs that they had. Next slide, please. And that brings me to Mendeley. So here I wanted to highlight another instance of, you know, this is data that's been shared in multiple locations. In particular, this data set in Mendeley is a subset of processed data that was used to create the figures for a publication. So like being able to provide that kind of data individually is helpful. Next slide, please. So here you can see the original complete data set published in the NCBI Gene Expression Omnibus, and then that's the related publication in iScience. So you know that the data in Mendeley is drawing on this NCBI data, and it's just a subset of that. Next slide, please. And so here I just wanted to point out that figure on the left is the figure 1 from the iScience publication. And then you can kind of see, looking back at the Mendeley data set, the files, and they have a file previewer. You know, so here we're looking at the file that supports this figure 1. And that file previewer, again, you know, allows you to look at the details of individual files. And that, again, supports discoverability, reusability, and reproducibility, all of those things. Next slide, please. All right, now we're on to OSF. This is a data set containing both analysis and simulations, and it's a fairly recent one, so you can see that reflected in the fact that the publication is only an archive so far. They haven't published it anywhere. because they just got it into archive, I believe, in September. And I want to highlight here the unique nature of OSF, where it offers a bit more of a working project space than some of our other repositories. So, you can use it to share and work with data collaboratively and more throughout the project versus other repositories where we're serving as just more of the final publication place for your data set. So it depends on what your needs are. OSF may be a better home for your data or a home for your data for part of your process. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so this is just some examples of how OSF, provides more of a working space for your data. They record a log of all of your activity in the data set, including adding and removing files, changes to the metadata, and then particularly you can see here the most recent activity was creating the DOI for this data set. So that being kind of the final activity on this one indicates, at least how I would interpret it, is that they've kind of finished up working with the data here and they're ready. They've published it now. They've put it on archive and I presume have submitted it for publication elsewhere. So you get more control over when the DOI is created here with your data set in OSF. And then also I wanted to point out you can also duplicate projects in OSF, which allows, again, encourages reuse, just by offering you the option to fully duplicate this data set, and then you can take it and work with it in your own space there. Next slide. And now we're at Vivli. I'm getting very down to the wire here. But Vivli is another of the GREI repositories. It's unique because it offers controlled access to your data, and they specifically support sharing clinical trials data and not just any kind of data, which the rest of us do. And this example here is of data reuse. On the left, you can see the metadata record in Vivli, and on the right, a request to use the data, and that's that controlled access piece. So anytime you want to use data that's in Vivli, you can't just look at it and download it. You do have to request access because it is more sensitive. Next slide, please. And then this is just quickly from the related publication of that data reuse. They took data from all of these different sources. These are all different data sets, and you can see that Vivli one in the orange box there. Next slide. And so this is just, you can see their data and code availability statement. The study with all of those data sets in it was published in Cell, and then they made their data and code available to Zenodo. So another crossover moment. And that actually brings me to next slide, to Zenodo. So Zenodo is another repository that accepts any kind of data. Here, I wanted to highlight this one that the researchers were able to package their data, both raw and processed, as well as related resources of data of the code and script and that sort of stuff, all in this one package here. And if you could go to the next slide, here's just kind of the preview of those different kinds of data in the Zenodo previewer. So yeah, this is, again, just a very quick walkthrough of examples. Just wanted to share those with you, and all of them are linked in the slides. So if you download the slides and want to explore these data sets, you can get into them. All right, and I think it looks like we kind of have answered Q&A, so thank you all for that. I do want to just quickly share a few points of connection. So if you want to get more information from us, please do download these slides, but you can also find all of our resources, including the slides, here in our Zenodo community, and we'll be publishing more resources there. Well, we hope to continue to publish more resources there for quite a while, but we have a few coming up soon that you can see listed there. Next slide. And then there's links, again, if you download the slides, to all of our help documentation for the specific repositories here, and some email addresses as well. Next slide. And then if you want to connect with us in other ways, we have a mailing list, a blog, and we also have recently launched a public GitHub repository, and that has a discussion board where you can give direct feedback to us on different things. So if you have a lot of thoughts on what GREI is up to, feel free to check that out and share your thoughts. And then finally, last slide here. We are having a community call in a couple of weeks, so if you want to register for that, that would be great. We're seeking feedback on the Generalist repository selection flowchart. We've basically made version 1, and that's what we showed earlier in this presentation. But we'd love to get feedback as we plan to develop the next version of that and make sure that it's a really clear and useful resources for you all. So that is that. I think that's everything. We're just about at the hour. I think, we're happy to have had you all join us. I don't know if there's any final questions anybody wants to throw in the chat or Q&A. Feel free. Oh, I see there's one, and we can hang on for a few minutes if you need, but I understand people probably have to leave as the hour is over. But yeah, I see a question about having well, this is a Vivli specific question. How Vivli accesses TCGA data. You know what, that is a question we would have to pass to Vivli probably.
I think if you look at the data set and Vivli, each of them have like how to contact about getting access. Like that's how the repository works. So I think it depends, but each data set that is restricted will have some information about how to get access or to ask for access.
Yeah, and I think the TCGA data should probably be that's an NIH platform, so I think that would be publicly available itself. But if you're trying to reuse that data plus data in Vivli, that might be two separate asks to different locations as well. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And yeah, we will be sending the recording and slides later this week. And there is a little post webinar survey if you don't mind taking it when you sign off here. Yeah. Cool. I think we're good. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And thank you, co-presenters.
Yeah.
All right.
Cheers, everybody.